So as Paula mentioned, I've been doing this for quite a long time. Started off in adult corrections, I've done juvenile corrections, and now for the last 10 years, been in charge of juvenile probation for the 4-county area. So to give you, I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of what that is, so that in the end, when we get, I want to give plenty of time for questions and answers, but I don't want you to feel like, the questions have got to be limited to civil citation. My experience base is very broad, and I'll give you some additional details. What a juvenile probation officer does, what I do with them, so that, if you've got some other questions that maybe deviate from the topic at hand, you certainly can feel comfortable asking those. And the other thing that I'll say as I go through the presentation, I will endeavor not to go really quick through this, even though I want to allow plenty of time for questions and answers. So that said, if I get to a slide, you got a question, please don't hesitate to ask. So in the state of Florida, when a child interacts with a law enforcement officer, aka they're arrested, from day one they're going to be involved with the juvenile probation officer. The juvenile probation officer initially is responsible for looking at what all of the circumstances surrounding that initial interaction. They're going to do an assessment of the child and their background, and they're going to make the initial recommendation of the state attorney as to whether or not we think, the department thinks, it's appropriate to do some form of a non-judicial diversion, or whether we think that the circumstances are significant enough that they should proceed with some kind of judicial interaction. Once they get past that, when the child goes to court, they're still going to be involved, the juvenile probation officer is still going to be involved through that court process, up to if they wind up being placed on some kind of juvenile probation. The juvenile probation officer would be involved with them also if they go on to some kind of a residential commitment program, and even post-commitment probation. So my juvenile probation officers, and I've got about 65 of them in the 4-county area. I've got 6 units, one in Walton County, Phoenix Springs. I've got one in Fort Walton, one in Crestview, one in Milton, and then we have 3 units here in Escambia County. So they're involved, our probation officers are involved with these children from the day they become involved with the system until the day they're done. So it can be as short as a few months, as long as a couple of years, depending on how long they're involved with the system. So as you kind of sit here, and we'll talk about civil citation, which is actually a pre-arrest diversion program. When you start thinking about different questions, kind of think not necessarily what do I want to know about civil citation, but what do you want to know about the juvenile system in general. So I'm going to start a little bit with the history of civil citation, specifically in Escambia County. We've had some form of civil citation in Escambia County since the late 90s. Initially, civil citation was run through the Escambia County Sheriff's Office. They were given grant funding. They ran it for 4 or 5 years. When the grant funding went away, the program went away. A few years later, would have been around 07 or 08, another federal grant came along. This time it was through the department, and Big Brothers Big Sisters ran initially civil citation for the 4-county area. They very quickly realized that was too big, and they narrowed it down and ran it specifically in Escambia County. It went another federal grant. Federal grant is seed money for 3 years. After 3 years, they expect that the local community to pick the ball up and run with it. Well, the same thing happened. We got to the end of that 3rd year, the money dried up, so did the program. So along about 2010, 2011, I started seeing a lot of requests for background for children that have gone through non-judicial programs. The non-judicial program is supposed to, in the end, wind up with a child who does not have a criminal record. But I was getting a lot of requests from the military for background information on kids that had gone through non-judicial programs. And I was kind of confused because ordinarily that's not information that they should have access to. And was promptly informed by the military that they are allowed to have access to that information if the child went through any kind of a program where there was a sanction that was treated as if they had received a judicial sanction. So at the same time I was seeing that, he is now Commander Dale Tharp, but back then it was Lieutenant Dale Tharp, was seeing a lot of arrests in the school. He was in charge of the school resource officers for the Escambia County Sheriff's Office. So he was seeing a lot of arrests for what he considered to be minor things in the school system. And the two of us kind of sat down and talked about how can we come up with a program? How can we come up with a civil citation program that is not dependent upon some kind of grant money, that in 2, 3, 4 years down the road, when money went away, the program went away. And we kind of developed, through me stepping up to the table and him stepping up to the table, with some resources that I had, some that he had, the first civil citation program in Escambia County, which was school-based. And that program ran for a couple of years, but we real quickly realized that it really wasn't fair if little Johnny over here, because he's in school and he has a retail theft, steals something minor from another kid in school, he has access to a civil citation. But little Jimmy goes into Bell's and steals some socks, and he doesn't, simply because one was done in school and one was not. So that was about 4 years ago. We kind of pushed, developed the agreements, and we now have an Escambia County civil citation that is available to any law enforcement officer can write it for any misdemeanor offense. And I'll go through as we get farther into this what those offenses are. So what is civil citation? Civil citation in statute, we look at it as it's a statewide process that we develop on the local level. It's authorized in Florida Statute 9512. And there were over the last couple of years, there have been several initiatives to make civil citation mandatory. They have not passed, didn't pass again this year. It is a may. The law enforcement officer may issue a civil citation, so there is some discretion built into the system. It's an alternative not to judicial handling, it's an alternative to an arrest. So in the end, I'll explain how all this works, but in the end, if the child is successful, not only do they not have an arrest record or a criminal record, they don't have an arrest record, which is really big. Because when you start talking about some of these different, when you talk about a law enforcement agency that's looking to potentially hire somebody, you're talking about the military, you're talking about people that want to go into the medical field or the educational field. They're allowed to dig farther into those backgrounds. Well, if we don't have an arrest, there's certainly not a criminal history that they can look at. So that's one of the big pluses with this. It is a method with which to hold the kids accountable for what they've done. One of the things that we've encountered over the years with this is this overwhelming idea that, oh, well, we're going to issue this traffic ticket. And there's not, there won't be a consequence to it. But you'll see as we go through, there very much is a consequence to it. It does help prevent further delinquency. What we see as far as recidivism rates go, about a 4% recidivism rate with civil citation. When you take the exact same kid, still have the arrest, but we do a non-judicial diversion, that increases to about 8 or 9%. So you're talking about this very same kid doing nothing different other than the process that we utilize, doubling the recidivism rate. And he's still, okay, so 9% really isn't that high, but we want the best, most effective method to handle this stuff that we can. And then obviously the last thing on the slide prevents the criminal record. If you don't have an arrest, you don't have a criminal record, which, as you know, like I said, when you start talking about military, law enforcement, medical, educational, renting a house, getting into college, all of those things are affected by those records. These are some of the required stakeholders that have to come together and agree. So while it's allowed in statute, what we have, Judge Nobles is our chief judge in Circuit 1. She signed off on it. Mr. Edens, the state attorney, Mr. Miller, he is the public defender. We've all sat down and worked through our agreement, and all of these have agreed. The department obviously has to be a party to it. And then the last key in that is the local law enforcement agency heads have to buy off on this program. In our circuit, we've got one county where we do not have that support. It's not here in Escambia. Both of our agencies in Escambia County, which, you know, Escambia County is certainly the largest population center in the circuit. Our two agencies are very much in support of the program in Escambia County. You see here, once again, statewide implementation on a local level. So while it's mandated, not really mandated, it's allowed, it's still very dependent upon local support. It's up to first three. Now, there's a caveat with that. They can only get a second or a third civil citation if they have been issued a first and successfully completed the program. If they did not complete that program successfully, they don't have the option to receive a second or third. It very much is dependent upon how the kid interacts with that program from the very beginning. All of our kids that come through the program receive a needs assessment. We're going to look at what their social background, what their family background, what kind of medical problems, mental health problems, substance abuse. All of that is going to be taken into consideration when we establish what sanctions we're going to utilize with that child as they come through that program. And it talks here about supervising entity. It's really kind of geared to other parts of the state. In Escambia County, I'm the supervising entity. Miami-Dade's a good example of this. Miami-Dade has got a very big juvenile tax base down there, so they're able to really establish a lot of programs that we don't have and probably never will have, just simply because the size of our community versus theirs. But we do all of the tracking with this. It's all input into our juvenile justice information system. We're able to track almost real time what's going on with some of our statistics with it. I apologize for the age of the data in this. It's from 13-14. Our website, you can get 15-16 data from our website now. And I just haven't updated my slides in a while, unfortunately. You see we had over 78,000 arrests that year. Almost right about half of those were for misdemeanor offenses. And then in Escambia County, a little over 1,000, and it still holds true, just a little less than half of those for misdemeanor offenses.
I was just wondering, is this only juveniles, the 78,000?
That was a statewide number of just juvenile arrests.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So what we're looking to do with this program is shift things very much to the front end, and to kind of talk about some timelines. If we arrest a kid and we go through that process to even get them into a non-judicial program, it's going to take somewhere in the neighborhood of usually 4 to 8 weeks for them to get through that process. Now, we kind of all know, anybody that's got kids, and I'm going to say probably most of you in the room do, if you let something go 2 days with a kid, that's a lifetime ago. So now to start talking about something that occurred 6, 8, 10 weeks ago, before you ever get around to dealing with the sanctions on that, the kids don't put that together. What we do with civil citation, though, the law enforcement officer issues that citation. Within 7 days, the child and or its parents have to contact us, and we start to go through the assessment process and get them hooked into some sanctions, usually within a week. It keeps our kids that really don't pose a significant threat, and we've got a very finite list of offenses that are eligible for civil citation. I'll go over that and you'll see. But it keeps them out of the deep end part of our system. It reduces our costs in terms of what it takes to process a child, because if an arrest is made, that means you've got the law enforcement officer, then you're going to have somebody from the department, then you're going to have somebody from the state attorney's office, potentially you're going to have somebody from the public defender's office, and then a judge, all involved with that case. Well, with civil citation, it's the law enforcement officer and then it's the department, and that's it. So you can see where we cut down a lot of expenses, we can expedite that process that way, freeing up a lot more time for my probation officers to interact with kids that are far more serious. In this day and age, with all of the different budget cuts we've had over the years, I've got about 10 fewer probation officers now than when I started 10 years ago. But yet the caseloads are still running very much close to what they were 10 years ago. So you can see there is a very definite need to really pare that down so that we can focus on the cases that really need us. With civil citation, I've only got one probation officer that kind of runs that program, and then she's got some resources that she uses to actually supervise the kids.